So let's begin with the first source that you looked at, which is from the Torah itself. And it's actually, the Gemara quotes the Torah. The context is in which people are fighting, assault and battery case, and there are 5 basic damages that a person has to pay if you hurt someone else. Tsar, Ripui, Shevet, Boshet, and Nezek. So they are, tsar means pain. You have to compensate the person for the pain that they have experienced. You have to compensate them. How you measure pain financially is a good question. So one view is that whatever the medical, let's say you broke their nose, God forbid, let's say they have to have their nose broken for a medical reason. And you could do it with anaesthetic or without. What does the anaesthetic cost? Right? You go to the dentist, you want to be macho, and you say, I don't want the anaesthetic. Okay? Or insane, one of the two. Right? So would you get a discount? Maybe. Right? I don't know. Right? So is it cost less of that? So that's the financial value of pain. Right? Then, of course, you have the shevet, which is unemployment. You have to pay the person a certain minimum wage while they're unemployed. Boshet, which is humiliation, embarrassment, depending on what you did, their status in society, what type of person they are, etc., etc. Nezek, which is the lessening or the lowering of their value. Right? An actuary calculates someone's, life expectancy and their financial value and with the injury, and financial value, life expectancy without the injury. The difference is what's called nezek, so you have to pay that. But the one that the Torah says explicitly, one of the ones that says explicitly, it says, "V'rapo yirapeh," you shall heal him. You shall heal him. It says it twice. Of course, if you look at the King James Authorized Version, when it says you shall heal him, it translates it as, thou shalt surely heal him. So whenever the Torah repeats a verb, the various translations usually translate it as thou shalt surely, which, as I'm sure you'll agree with me, is utterly meaningless. Right? Doesn't mean anything. Right? The repetition of the verb, according to the Talmud, implies a couple of things. It implies that A, very often it means you have to repeat the action. So when it says you should return lost property, it actually repeats the verb, to teach us that I have to make the attempt at returning it numerous times. Okay? Or, for example, when it says you shall rebuke, it says it double verb, in order to teach you that rebuke is not just once, I told you once, right? But rather, it must be an ongoing process. Nicely, but an ongoing process. V'rapo yirapeh, heal him, is interpreted, according to some, as meaning it must be done again and again. So if you injured someone, you need to pay for his medical expenses, and he has a relapse, the same condition, right? Again, the healing wasn't complete or something like that, you must again pay for the healing. So that's one interpretation. However, Rabbi Yishmael, we have quoted here, understands it in the following way. He says, from here we see that the Torah has been given permission to the physician to heal. What is the nature of this permission? Why does a physician need permission to heal? Rabbi Yishmael says, we see from here that it's permitted for a physician to heal. Why on earth would you think it's not permitted? Like, what possible reason could you have for prohibiting someone to heal someone? So there's a number of different interpretations of this. The one interpretation is, and this is something which in many religions believe, that healing is something which is human intervention in God's divine will is something inappropriate. So there are various religions that are actually against medical intervention. They feel it's wrong to do a transfusion. They feel it's wrong to do any type of medical intervention. And even Christian Scientology, etc. But even religions which permit it, so for example in Catholicism, they have an understanding that even though it's permitted to have medical intervention, but they say extraordinary measures are wrong. You should not go to extraordinary length. What exactly is the definition of that is something discussed in their various morals, etc., but in some of their journals. But basically, right, so some would argue what it means. Why do you need permission? Because since a person could say, a religious person could say, incorrectly, could say, well, God has smitten, who am I to intervene? Right? God has hurt, who am I to prevent that? Right? How can I possibly intervene? So here the Torah clearly says it is permitted to intervene, it is permitted to involve yourself in medical intervention. However, Maimonides, who by the way was a physician himself, right, wrote medical texts and was the physician of the court of the vizier, the Sultan of Egypt, and Salah al-Din, his name is Saladin. You may have heard of Saladin, right? So Salah al-Din. So anyway, Maimonides writes, he says he doesn't believe that's the reason, because he says there cannot be, in Judaism it's inconceivable that someone would actually think that it's prohibited to have medical intervention. He says, because it's not logical, it doesn't make sense. He says, would you think that if you're hungry you shouldn't eat, because who am I to intervene? God made me hungry. Who am I to eat? Right? Obviously, he says, that doesn't make any sense. Right? And so he says, therefore, it must be that the permission here is the format of it may be for one of two reasons. A, right, physical intervention. A physician, a doctor intervenes. Very often there are negative side effects. Very often. The doctor may cause you pain in trying to heal you. The doctor may give you a medication which maybe gets rid of the headache and causes you terrible stomach pains. The doctor may do an operation, etc. These are things which are risky. Not only are they risky, they cause you pain, they cause you injury, right? But they are for the greater good. So how do I know that I, let's say as a physician, will be allowed to do that? To enter into this area of risk, to enter the area of giving you pain, to reduce the pain. That the Torah tells us permitted, and there are many others who say that here the repetition of the verb is not just to tell me that it's permitted, but to tell me that it's actually a mitzvah, an obligation to engage in medical intervention. And this is not the only source for that obligation, that's sourced at other places as well. The question is, what's the extent of that? So it's clear that medical intervention is clearly so that it means to heal someone who has lost the function, the use of a limb, right, who cannot properly function physically, who is in tremendous pain. Okay, but what about other types of interventions? So the first thing I want to discuss is something like cosmetic surgery, even though it's the third in the title. Cosmetic surgery is not usually a matter of pain. Usually it's a matter of a person would like to look different or better. Right? The person would like, they feel their nose it just doesn't look great. Right? Or a person may feel that that they have a mole or some type of mark on them, which is unpleasant. They don't like it. So is that considered? Does that come under the heading of "you shall heal him"? So first and foremost, one of the questions we have to deal with, in order to do cosmetic surgery, that requires wounding, that requires cutting. Usually, I don't know of any cosmetic surgery that doesn't, but there has to be some cutting. So here some say there is actually a prohibition. You'll see in source number 2. It is prohibited for a person to injure themselves. You're not allowed to cause yourself injury. We are of the opinion that the body belongs to God. Your life belongs to God. So suicide is prohibited by Jewish law. But not only is suicide prohibited, but also, as the Gemara says initially, your blood I will require for your soul. But not only is suicide prohibited, but actually injury of the self is also prohibited. And actually, the Talmud says not only is injury prohibited, but if you look at the end of the piece of Talmud, number 2, we'll see not only injury, but even denying oneself permissible pleasure is considered questionable and might be considered a sin. That's an incredible thing. What about dieting? Right? Denying yourself. So it appears from here that A, the most severe case, you cannot kill yourself. B, you cannot injure yourself. And C, according to Rabbi Elazar HaKapar, by the way, the remnant of his base medrash, his yeshiva, which was in the Golan Heights, can be seen today if you go to the Archaeological Museum in Katzrin, which is a beautiful little city in the Golan Heights. Very famous. They have spring water they bottle there, and there's also wineries there. So there's an archaeological museum there, which I saw, and there is the lintel from the doorpost of the yeshiva, and it actually says on it, Beit Midrasho Shel Rabbi Elazar HaKapar. The base medrash, the house of study of Rabbi Elazar HaKapar. Is that unbelievable? You learn a Gemara and you go to the Golan Heights, you can see that he lived in the Golan Heights and he had his yeshiva up there. It was mind-blowing to me when I saw that. Absolutely incredible. Anyway, that's an aside. Rabbi Elazar HaKapar goes to the point of saying a Nazarite, which is a Jew who takes a vow, a man or a woman, takes a vow that they'll become a Nazarite. What does it mean to be a Nazarite? They must let their hair grow, right? They must not, basically groom themselves. They're not allowed to have any grape products. So that means, now, by the way, a lot of food in Talmudic times had vinegar in it, which was made from grapes. Even today, a lot of things have vinegar in them. Mayonnaise, right? Salad dressings and ketchup. So let's say, you want to socialise with friends, right? So stay away. Alcohol, right? Wine, vinegar, ketchup, mayonnaise, right, salad dressing, etc., makes it a little difficult, and that was designed so he would not have wine or any grape products, etc. Right? He would not be able to go to a cemetery or to become contact with the dead. In other words, he'd become somewhat of a monk in a certain level, right? And at the end of that period of time, he'd have to bring a sin offering. And it says in the Torah, he must bring an offering for that which he has sinned against the soul. And the Talmud points out here, which soul has he sinned? Against which soul has he sinned? The answer is he sinned against his own soul, because he denied himself something which God said is okay. So, according to this, how could it ever be permissible for a person to actually go and say, okay, I want cosmetic surgery? Surely it is considered to be injuring or damaging yourself. So I'm sure you figured this out from Maimonides. Because if you look at Maimonides, very, very clear from Maimonides, that he doesn't say that it's not a problem at all. If you look at Maimonides, he says, and I put it in boldface in the Hebrew and in italics in the English, right? He says this: it is prohibited for a person to injure himself or others. He says, whether man or etc., in a vanquishing manner. In the Hebrew, the term is derech nitza umariva, derech nitza ubizayon, which means in a vanquishing in a fight or through a humiliating way. There's differences in the manuscript reading here. Some say it's humiliating way, some say it's in an injurious way. Either a way, right, if I am injuring someone in a positive way, can you injure someone in a positive way? Appendectomy, right? Tonsillitis, right? Cosmetic surgery. Is that damaging? Is that humiliating? Or is that positive? The answer is it's clearly positive. According to Maimonides, it's not that the danger to life is overriding the prohibition of wounding someone. That's not what it's about. There is no prohibition. The prohibition is only if I'm doing it in order to hurt you. Right? If I'm doing this in order to humiliate you. If I'm doing this, I'm a physician. I'm doing this in order to save your life. I'm doing this in order to make you look better. I'm doing this in order to improve your health. There is no prohibition in the first place. We had an interesting question, right? What about, I used to do, back in Israel before I turned decrepit, I used to do full contact sparring, so karate, whatever. We discussed this with Rav Scheinberg, and my sparring partner and I discussed it with Rav Scheinberg. It wasn't really a sparring partner. He used to beat me up on a regular basis, and I would pay him for this. It's a little strange. If there's any psychologists here, I need some help, I think, probably. Anyway, so so we asked Rav Scheinberg about this. So he actually cited this. He says, no, you're not the purpose of Moshe trying to hit me, right? It's not because he wants to hurt me. It's because to train me. He wants to train me how to block, right? So even if he does hurt me, he felt that is not. So I said, oh, thanks a lot, Rav Scheinberg. I'll go to another rabbi next time. But basically, right, he says his intent is not to hurt. And in the case of training, let's say, for self-defense, even if it involves sometimes hurting someone, and which it does, right, when you train, if it's real training, then there's going to be pain. There is going to be pain, right? The Nordic track concept. No pain, no gain. Right. So anyway, according to Maimonides, this would be permitted. So certainly, if the person... So we see that there is no prohibition in essence of doing the operation. But you might argue that nevertheless it's an intervention which is inappropriate. There is a Rabbi, Eliezer Yehuda Waldenberg, that sits Eliezer. He maintained that it was prohibited to do cosmetic surgery because it doesn't come under the category of healing. What are you healing? The person's healthy. They're fine. So they've got a Jewish nose, right? They don't have dimples. They don't have a cleft in the chin. What about that? That's their healthy. He says if a person was, God forbid, disfigured in a fire, in a car accident, then it's a legitimate intervention. You're certainly allowed to do cosmetic surgery. But merely to improve your appearance, you cannot do that. However, it's type of interesting to note, the Gemara in Shabbos talks about pulling off a scab, right? It talks about, you saw that Gemara, it's number 4. And the Gemara says that that one may scrape off the dirt scabs and wound scabs that are on his flesh because of the pain. But if it's in order to beautify himself, it's prohibited. Whose view do they adopt? So they say it was taught one must wash his face, hands and feet daily in his Maker's honour. As it says, the Lord hath made everything for his own purpose. The Talmud's conclusion seems to be that it's an obligation to keep yourself looking good. It is why? Because the human is the image of God. The human represents God in this earth. So the human being, therefore, I am, in a sense, by keeping myself dignified, clean and healthy, I am basically taking care of something, a being who's created in the image of God. And hence represents God, and hence should be treated with appropriate respect and honour. But here it says not only to beautify himself, but certainly everyone agrees that you can take off these scabs on Shabbat because of the pain, right? But in order to beautify yourself, not. So what type of pain? So if you look at Tosfot, commentary of Tosfot number 5, Tosfot maintains, what if the person's pain is that he's too embarrassed to walk amongst people? In other words, it prevents social interaction, normal social discourse. He says, it is also permitted as there is no greater pain than this. Ein lechatzar gadol is an interesting insight of Tosfot. They maintain that, you know what? They feel that, you know, emotional pain, Tosfot says, is probably even worse than physical pain. The pain that a person has, they cannot normally interact with other people because they are extremely self-conscious about their appearance, or because maybe there's some objective aspect of their appearance that makes it very difficult. There are certain blemishes that a person just can't stop looking at this. Right? People can't stop looking. It maybe has prevented this person from getting married. Right? Maybe it's preventing this person from getting a job. Right? Is this not painful? The person can't have a normal conversation. The case is brought in the authorities. A man generally is not allowed to do, men and women, man is not allowed to wear women's clothing, women is not allowed to wear men's clothing, according to the biblical law. Right? What's the definition of men's clothing, women's clothing is not so easy to define. But in addition to clothing, it says a man is not supposed to do womanly things, and vice versa. What's a womanly thing? So, for example, one of the things that a man is not supposed to do is dye his hair. Right? So just go old with grace. Grecian 5000, all that type of stuff. Forget it. Right? So in Judaism, we say not allowed to dye hair. So the case was, a guy had a strange condition. His beard was half white, half black. Only half his beard went white. So Tosfot permitted him to dye his beard. I'm not sure which half, but it doesn't matter. Right? He permitted him to dye his beard. Why, he says? Because the guy looks like a clown. He's embarrassed to go out. He can't have normal conversations with people because people are always like looking at his beard. Right? Isn't that pain? So therefore, if you're a physician who does cosmetic surgery and you are healing a person of that pain, now, clearly, what about, there can be sometimes frivolous cosmetic surgery. Right? And here, it's very difficult to know. It's very difficult to judge this type of thing. The person has to know in and of themselves, is this something which is frivolous? They want to just look like who is the latest supermodel, right? Or the latest Australian film star, you know, like Russell Crowe or whatever, you know, like, everyone wants to look like a regular Australian like myself. But let's say, right, it's not that funny, right? So, but if a person wants to do that, is that frivolous? And that may be frivolous, and their authorities may. So Moshe Feinstein, for example, permits someone to have cosmetic surgery if they feel, and probably he says that this would require conversations with maybe someone who's more objective, right? It's very hard to make, you know, to do this totally on your own. He says if the person feels that it's preventing their social interaction, certainly if it's preventing them from getting married, then he permits such a thing. The Chelkas Yaakov, Rabbi Yaakov Breish, a very famous halachic authority from Switzerland, was asked by a woman who wanted to have a nose job, and he permitted this. He said such a thing is okay. One of the sources he quoted was Maimonides, and another source he quotes is this Tosfot, and he indeed permitted such a thing. So when it comes to cosmetic surgery, and certainly virtually all authorities, including the Tzitz Rebbe Eliezer Waldenberg, who was stringent about cosmetic surgery, all authorities permit it in the case of disfigurement, in the case of a disease that causes this disfigurement. Everyone agrees that it's okay. Yeah.
I mean, the Tosfot seems to say too embarrassed to walk amongst people.
Right.
It's a pretty severe degree of psychological pain, right? So based on the Tosfot itself, it's possible to prevent cosmetic surgery.
Sure. Well, no, not only based on that.
Really disfigured. Right?
I've got Maimonides as well. Right, Maimonides just says the actual cutting process is not prohibited because it's for a positive purpose. Tosfot is there to tell me that this is also considered healing. Social embarrassment is also healing. It doesn't have to be. I don't know if it's correct that you have to interpret it as the most severe thing. It's a subjective thing. He's too embarrassed to walk amongst people. Right? You know what? There are people who are not horribly disfigured who are also embarrassed. Right? It prevents, and it's understood by Rav Yaakov. Understood.
Wouldn't it mean that you would be so embarrassed about your blemish, whatever it is you want to enhance or better, that you would literally be a shut-in. You would not go outside.
Well, I don't think you have to. I think that's too strict an interpretation. I think what it means is the guy's embarrassed. He may go out because he has to buy groceries, he has to get a job, but it's embarrassing for him. It's embarrassing for him. I think that's the simple meaning of it. And so Rav Yaakov Breish understands that type of psychological pain, and certainly, since we have an obligation, at least for a man, obligation to have children, to get married, etc., to get married and then have children, right? But basically, right, also, if he feels preventing that, then it also may be permitted. Now we come to tattooing. Okay, tattooing, which of course, as you know, is involved in a lot of cosmetic surgery, very often burn victims get what they call micropigmentation, which is a form of tattooing. Sometimes they tattoo eyebrows onto a person. If a person has surgery on their lips, it is very often a certain type of micropigmentation tattooing would be used to look like normal lips, even though they've had cosmetic surgery. There's many types of that type of tattooing which is actually used. But again, let's do the simple tattooing, right? I joined the Navy, right? I'm in Bangkok and slightly drunk, right? And of course, the massive peer pressure, all my friends, right? And so we go out and we get some obscene thing tattooed on our bicep, which is very normal for most of us, right? It's the type of thing that happens all the time, right? So the Torah says that it's prohibited to do this, and it says very explicitly, right? It's not like this is the Torah says seret lenefesh lo titnu b'basarach, and that first of all means that you're not allowed to mutilate yourself as a sign of mourning, which there are, by the way, some religions that do that. There are people who mutilate themselves as a sign of mourning. Judaism prohibits this, and in that same verse it says uktovet ka'aka lo titnu bachem, you shall not place a piercing type of writing. Ktovet means writing. Kaka means piercing, as Rashi explains. Rashi, in his famous book Adlock, writes, writing that is engraved, right, I mean it's quoted everywhere, right, writing that is engraved and sunk, that cannot be erased. He pierces the skin with a needle, it is blackened permanently. And kaka is from, he brings two verses that indicate that the word kaka is to pierce. So here, very clear, Rashi's definition of tattooing is when there's two components. The flesh is pierced, or cut, and ink, some type of permanent dye or ink is put into the flesh to create something permanent. Right? Now, what's the rationale behind the prohibition? Not that it makes a big difference according to halacha, but it may. Right? What's the rationale behind the prohibition? So I have quoted here the Seforno, also another doctor, right, in his commentary on the Torah, and he writes that the way he sees it is that any type of body modification, it sounds like, from what he's saying, the body is holy and perfectly designed by God. The only permanent sign that may be made on a Jewish person is the sign of circumcision. Anything else is type of an affront to that. However, it's clearly true that you're allowed to do some level of body modification. Because, as someone pointed out to me before, and there's many places in the Torah where we find that the standard adornment for women in ancient times, and indeed it has come back into fashion, are nose rings, right, and pierced ears. Right, and people pierce various other parts of themselves, right? So piercing in and of itself, there is no one in the Torah itself. In fact, 2 weeks ago, we read in the Torah portion that Eliezer, the servant of Abraham, came to betroth a wife for his master's son, Rivka, and what does he give her? He gives her bracelets, and he gives her a nose ring. Right, it was a standard thing. Now, today, in the religious world, it's a little unusual for a woman to have a nose ring, right? In the secular world, it's pretty standard. It's not like an unusual thing, right? In the religious world, it's unusual, but it certainly would not be considered prohibited. What about for a man to have an earring? So here, as I mentioned before, there is what we call the prohibition of wearing women's clothing or men wearing. So the definition of what's women's clothing and what's men's clothing, right, is a bit fluid. It depends on where you live, and it depends on what the norm is, right? So, for example, nowadays, I would say it's pretty normal, right? I don't know what the percentages are, but for a man to have an earring is not at all an unusual thing, right? I'm not so sure if it would be prohibited as women's clothing, because we don't generally define it by the limited clothing of the religious Jewish community, right? It's defined much more by the general community. So, for example, I have a student, one of my students from Sameach, from Scotland. He wore a dress at his wedding, called a kilt. He wore a kilt. So the Scottish men wear a kilt, right? I mean, if they have nice knees, right? But they tend to they wear a kilt. He wears wearing. There's no prohibition in that of wearing women's clothing because it's clearly men's clothing, right? So the same is true of the earring. Of course, here one takes into account the social acceptability. There's a bit of a stigma because in Jewish tradition, the only time a man in biblical times, the only time a man would ever have an earring or pierced ear, generally, the only time it's mentioned in the Torah regarding a man who had pierced ear is a slave who was, let's say, some guy who was sold because he stole money, he couldn't pay it back, and he doesn't want to leave his master's house, so the master pierces his ear. So the stigma involved with that is that it's a sign of a slave to a certain degree in the biblical perspective. I'm not saying that's a legal prohibition. I'm just saying there's a bit of a stigma involved with it in the religious world. Yeah.
What about, I don't see a lot of Orthodox men wearing wedding bands. What's that?
Well, that's a wedding band also, because in the Jewish wedding ceremony, generally it's a one-way thing. In other words, the man gives his wife a ring. And actually, he's supposed to give the woman to betroth her, he has to give her something of value. If she actually gives him something in exchange, it may invalidate the wedding. Because instead of giving her something, if she's giving him something of equal or greater value, has he given her anything? No. Right? So therefore, you're not allowed to have, strictly speaking, you should not have a double ring ceremony, right, in a traditional Jewish wedding. So therefore, right, it's not fashionable. But it's nothing wrong with after the wedding, the guy can wear a wedding ring. That's certainly permissible. Right? In fact, the Talmud talks about men wearing rings all the time. The Talmud talks about, they used to actually, when they used to write a document, they would roll it up, tie it with string, and then put some clay on it, and then you'd seal it with your signet ring, with a special, not a signet, but a ring with your seal, right? And it was right. It's called a bulla, a clay bulle, right? And those clay bulle, right? We still have one. We still have one from the scribe of Jeremiah, the prophet, right? Who is known as Baruch the son of Neriah, the scribe. We have 3 clay seals that belong to Baruch the son of Neriah, who wrote down the prophecies of Jeremiah. We have clay seals from the courts of the kings of the house of David, found in the city of David, etc. Amazing stuff. But anyway, so that's certainly allowed. Again, the reason it's not so much fashion amongst the religious community, although there are large segments of the religious community, men who do wear wedding bands, right? It's not such a fashion because the fact that it's not part of the ceremony, so it just never caught on really. Okay, but it's certainly permitted to do so. Now, in terms of tattooing, right, so the logic here seems to be that Maimonides seems to have a different logic. If you look in the Gemara in Makkas number 8, the Gemara describes what is considered to be the incision or not. There is one opinion, that is Rav Shimon, not everyone agrees with this, but Rav Shimon says the only prohibition is actually when you actually written the name of God. Right? Other authorities say it only is prohibited, right, the name, the Gemara seems to explain that it's only liable for having done it if you put a foreign, like an idol, a name of an idol on it. Right? Why? Because if you look in Maimonides number 9, he actually explains that idolaters used to tattoo themselves specifically with the name of their deity as a way of saying, I belong to this deity. I belong to this deity. So they'd write it on, they'd tattoo it on their flesh, right, as a way of saying that's to whom I belong. And consequently, there is an opinion in the Talmud, this is not accepted according to law, there's an opinion in the Talmud that it's only prohibited if the person actually puts a profane, a pagan deity's name on their tattoo. If you look at Maimonides, Maimonides doesn't say that. And he says, he does mention that as a logic, but all Maimonides says is that it's that even if it's writing. But I should point out there is a major argument amongst later authorities: is the biblical prohibition only when it's writing and pictures, or is it anything? This comes into play when we talk about I mentioned before permanent makeup, because permanent makeup has no writing and has no pictures; it's just colour. So there is one opinion. Rav Avigdor Nebenzahl was a very famous authority in Israel. He maintained he was what we call a shittas yachid, a loner in this. The vast majority of authorities do not permit permanent makeup because they consider it tattooing. Rav Nebenzahl's logic that he said it was okay was the fact that he said that it was not if it was permanent, but if it was let's say a few months. There's certain permanent makeup is only a few months. His was okay, and his logic was that it appears from Rashi and Maimonides that it's only prohibited if it's permanent, if it will stay forever. Right? And secondly, he says, according to most authorities, it appears to him that it's only prohibited if it's actually pictures or words. But if here, it's not pictures or words, just pigment, just colour. And he says colour is not prohibited. But the vast majority of halachic authorities, legal authorities, maintain that it is prohibited even if it's just colour. What is considered to be permanent, by the way? How do we define permanent? So it's interesting. Rashi in the Talmud says if it's something which remains le'olam. What does le'olam mean? It means forever. There's another one of the great authorities called the Nimukei Yosef, who is a commentary on his commentary is a super commentary. By super commentary, we don't mean a commentary that changes clothes in a phone booth and saves people. What we mean is a commentary on a commentary, a super commentary, right? So the Nimukei Yosef is a commentary on Rav Yitzchak Alfazi. He says it's prohibited even if it's, he says, l'zman aroch. Zman aroch means it'll stay for a long time. So according to the simple reading of Rashi, it means it's only prohibited biblically if it's forever. And according to Nimukei Yosef, it's prohibited biblically even if it's for a long time. There are those who argue that even when Rashi says la'olam, forever, he doesn't mean literally forever. How do we know this? Because the Gemara discussed putting ashes on a wound. If a person got hurt and he put ashes on the wound, so generally what will happen is that a question of, is that tattooing? The fact is there's an incision, which is condition number one, and then you put some dye or ink, which is condition number two. So isn't that a tattoo? So there's an argument in the Gemara as to whether it's permitted or not. Right? The accepted opinion seems to be that it's okay. Why? Because the very fact that it's a wound proves that it's not a tattoo. Now that's a strange statement. What does that mean? The wound proves it. So some say what that means is the fact that it's on a wound proves that it's not going to be permanent. He's not putting it on, that's not permanent. He's just putting it on. I guess they felt that ashes would disinfect or protect the wound. I'm not exactly sure what the medical component of that is, but they believed that ashes were good for a wound, correctly or incorrectly, I have no idea. But again, we're putting it on, so some would say since it's on the wound, it's not going to be permanent. It's going to wash off eventually, the wound will heal, and this will go away as well. Right? Others say, and this is like a little controversial, others say that it's only prohibited if you've only transgressed the biblical prohibition if your intention is to actually tattoo something on your flesh. If your intention is not for that, for something totally different, then it's okay. In fact, there's a view that if a person tattoos, let's say in the days when there was slavery, a person tattoos his slave so that he can't run away. Has he transgressed? Some say no. Because it's not for the intention of the decoration or the etc. It's for a totally different. So if the person's doing it for medical reasons, as in this case, that would of course be an interesting leniency to use in medical tattooing. Right? Clearly, as I pointed out, when they talk about the targeted radiation therapy, and they use a tattoo to, let's say, tattoo around the area where the tumour is, etc., so they can have a permanent tattoo, that's clearly okay, because we have always a principle in Jewish law that pikuach nefesh, saving of life, overrides just about everything. There are three cardinal sins that it doesn't override, right? Murder, idolatry, and sexual immorality, but everything else it overrides. So Shabbat and Yom Kippur and Kashrut and tattooing, certainly overridden by danger of life. If the physician feels, right, that this is important for the healing of this person who's got a life-threatening sickness, etc., then it's certainly permitted. I don't think anyone would prohibit that. Right? However, here is a leniency that may be applied in the case of cosmetic tattooing. Because we said cosmetic tattooing, first of all, it may be that since it's not words, first of all, we have the view in the Talmud that if it's not the name of a pagan deity, it's not prohibited. Granted, we don't rule in accordance with that. But then we have those who say that if it's not writing, it's not biblically prohibited. And combine that with those who say that if it's not with the intent, even though these are all minority views, if it's not the intention of the person to actually do it for adornment, they're rather doing it for a reason like here, it's a medical reason to look normal. Have eyebrows. People have eyebrows. He wants eyebrows. It's normal. You want normal lips, right? So such a thing would be, according to many authorities, permissible, even though it's not saving of life, it's a cosmetic surgery type situation. But there are many authorities who would be lenient for some of the reasons that I mentioned above. Interesting to note, Maimonides says the person transgressing is primarily the one doing it. Do you see that? Maimonides says that if you just sit there passively and allow someone to do it and didn't help them, he says you may not incur the maximum liability. Although the Code of Jewish Law says it is still prohibited, because that's the classic case of tattooing. Right? Now, what about the obligation? Is there an obligation ever to remove the tattoo? Do you have to remove a tattoo? If a person had a tattoo, right? I know people who were not always committed to Judaism and have tattoos. Right? In fact, the guy I used to spar with, right, he had some tattoos. So he actually had them removed. Right? I say spar. My kids always say, Abba, it's spar. Right? People think you used to go to the sauna with him. Right? So it's, excuse my pronunciation. Right? So spar is what I meant. Right? So he had these tattoos. He had them removed. Now, he went to Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah said, you're not obligated to do so. Not obligated to do so. But he said, but if there's ever something stolen in the mikveh, they'll blame you. But anyway, leave that aside. Right? But certainly there's no obligation to do so. Why? Because the actual prohibition is the actual doing the tattooing. It's not having it on you. In fact, the Holocaust survivors were told by a famous rabbi, I forgot who they asked, but he said, on the contrary, do not remove those tattoos. He says, wear them as a badge of honor, right? That you suffered because of the fact that you were Jewish and you survived and God helped you through the experience. And he says, do not remove them. So he actually said it was wrong to remove it. But even if there is a case, a guy had an obscene tattoo, right there. Now he became religious and he started putting on tefillin. He felt somewhat uncomfortable putting the tefillin on this, I won't tell you what it was, but it was obscene. Right? So he felt rather uncomfortable. Rabbi Yosef ruled that he's not obligated, but he thinks it might be a good idea to remove it. But it's not obligatory. So actually removing, and to dispel that myth, right, of the tattooing in the Jewish cemetery, not to be buried in a Jewish cemetery, I think probably the origin of that is, it's not clear. I couldn't really find a clear origin to that. I think probably the origin of it is that in let's say in early time in New York, 100 years ago, etc., if they would find a person, a body, okay, a dead body, or an unconscious person, okay, and the person had tattoos, would they assume he's Jewish or not Jewish? Not Jewish. Since it's prohibited in Jewish law to have a tattoo, and Jews until recently were pretty careful about that prohibition, it would be a safe assumption to say that this body or this patient was not Jewish. So that either they bury him in a non-Jewish cemetery, or they would take him, let's say, they wouldn't take him to a Jewish hospital, take him to a regular hospital. So people got the idea, what people got the idea was, so if you have a tattoo, you can't be buried in a Jewish cemetery. You hear where that came from? I think that might be the logic. I think where that come from. But really, now, as the authorities say, look, getting a tattoo is a sin. A person did a sin. Let's imagine that we wouldn't bury people who've done a sin. We wouldn't bury in a Jewish cemetery. What would Jewish cemeteries look like? Be golf courses. There wouldn't be anyone. It's like no one would be there, right? Who doesn't? Right? Everyone's done something wrong. Right? There's no one who hasn't ever sinned. Like, look, we do say you should not bury an evil person next to a righteous person. Right? It is incorrect. The Code of Jewish Law says we don't bury an evil person next to a righteous person, and a person who, let's say, was a particularly evil person we might bury in a separate part of the cemetery, so he's not next to the righteous people. But a person with a tattoo doesn't define a person as evil. We're talking about a murderer, son of Sam. Right? I wouldn't bury him in the regular pot, right? He still deserves a Jewish burial. Wasn't he Jewish?
He was adopted by Becher.
Thank God. All these years. I don't feel guilty anymore. It's awesome, right? Oh, you feel bad, son of Sam. Okay, that's great. Thank you very much. Worth it just for this. But anyway, so there is no prohibition against that. Now, if you'll see the words of Rikusi Yehuda Greenwald, who wrote one of the great works on mourning and burial, etc., etc., if for whatever reason a Jewish person does have a tattoo, nevertheless, he or she unequivocally can and must be buried in a Jewish cemetery. So that's a summary of the basic ideas. We've covered, I think, most of the cases that I said that I wanted to talk about. As I said, certainly micropigmentation for the sake of surgery in which there is radiation therapy, in which there is danger to life, certainly permitted. If it's tattooing or micropigmentation for the sake of cosmetic surgery to fix a disfigurement, that appears to be, many authorities permit that. Cosmetic surgery, that appears to be an argument. Eliezer Yehuda Waldenberg does not feel that that is included under the general permission or mitzvah of healing. However, many authorities disagree with him. The Chelkas Yaakov, the Igros Moshe, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, Rabbi Yaakov Breish disagree with him and say that if that person does experience embarrassment, if this person feels that she or he is not able to get married as a result of this, it's really preventing them from having a normal social life, then it would be permitted. And again, the idea is that the prohibition of wounding is only when the intention was negative, the intention was to hurt, the intention was to humiliate, but if the intention is positive, it's okay. And even those who are stringent, like Eliezer Yehuda Waldenberg in cosmetic surgery, he would permit it in the case of a person who was disfigured by an accident or a disease, etc. One more point I should mention regarding piercing and tattoos, maybe two more points, but regarding piercing and tattoos is the health issues involved. Okay, certainly, and cosmetic surgery. Cosmetic surgery does involve a certain level of danger. Any time a person's under general anaesthetic, there's a certain level of danger. It's not something without risk. Going to the hospital is risky. Certainly in New York, but I mean it doesn't matter. Anywhere, but going to the hospital is risky. There are diseases people pick up. What's the term for it? I've got the technical term for it. But there are infections person can get and from the surgery itself. That's right. And so therefore that's something to take into consideration. Obviously the operation itself, the more these things become common, the more medical science progresses, the less danger there is in doing this. Actually, if you look at authorities in the mid-20th century, are much more stringent about cosmetic surgery, and one of the main reasons they're stringent about it is because it's a dangerous thing. But we have a rule that if millions of people do something, lots and lots of people do something, and they survive, even if intrinsically there's some level of danger, it's okay to do it. It's what we call shomer pesoim Hashem, God guards the fool. Right? Which means if enough people are foolish to enter into this danger, but guess what? Most people survive statistically, that means there is some level where it's no longer considered dangerous. Certainly with piercings, a person has to take into account infection issues, etc. Personally, if I can rant, and I'll finish with the rant, there are people who do piercing of girls' ears as soon as they're born. I mean, it's like... I find this shocking and horrific. Right? I see there's no religious reason to do this. I don't know if I don't know. I always felt it was like objectification of her with jewelry as soon as she's born. Like, give her a break, let her grow up. Right? But okay, it's like a lot of Hasidic communities. It's almost like a religious thing. Right? They pierce the girl's ear as soon as that's it. First thing, but there's no obligation to do that. That's for sure. Right? Whether it's permitted or not to do for the baby, I don't know. I guess it's okay because piercing is something which people do. Rivka was only 3 when she had her nose ring put on by Eliezer. I don't know if he actually did the piercing, but she was only 3 when she had a nose ring, so that would appear to be okay. And so that's it. That's pretty much an overview of the subject. There's obviously, as you see from the sources, every one of the sources I brought here, there are numerous commentaries on these sources, right? And there's literally hundreds of pages written about this. So the vastness of the Torah is something which is, to master the whole thing is almost an impossibility, right? But it's our obligation to try anyway. So the fact that you've come here and tried is a wonderful thing, and I commend all of you for doing that. And it'd be great. I hope to see you at the Elders of Zion. In our last meeting, went to great efforts to make a holiday weekend on December 25th so that Jews can do seminars like this. Right? So don't waste the effort that the International Jewish Conspiracy has put into this, right? And please don't tell anyone else, right? And see if you can come. You'll have a great time. And if I may also do a plug, if anyone's interested in just knowing all of Judaism in 500 pages, get my book, Gateway to Judaism. Get it on Amazon, Jewish bookstores, Barnes & Noble, or from me right now, $20. Anyway, that's it. Thank you very much.